Alrighty then. So my name is Hayden Thomas. I'm currently a student here at UW Superior. I've been going here the past 4 years. I'm a transportation and logistics management major and GIS minor. I was kind of introduced to GIS through an environmental science class I had my sophomore. I thought that was kind of interesting. Didn't know anything about it initially, what GIS was or what it is, a tool, a science, and then kind of came to get more interested into it, add the minor to my major, and then I guess here I am all those years later. I'll be presenting my undergraduate research project from this past semester to complete my GIS minor, looking at how the United States gets its supply of automobiles. So to begin with and open up with, I'm going to be defining what is an automobile. It's kind of important to define that just what I'm tracking and what I'm researching. So I've attached two dictionary definitions, the first being the Merriam-Webster definition of usually a four-wheeled automotive vehicle designed for passenger transportation, as well as the Oxford definition of a road vehicle, typically with four wheels, powered by internal combustion or electric motor, and able to carry a small number of people. This is significant because if people think of cars, vehicles, it's kind of synonymous, but I have tracked the automobiles. So my definition, my data, things I'm looking at, don't extend to things like semi and dump trucks, bicycles, and buses. Those would be vehicles and not automobiles. So looking at the initial automobile development, Carl Benz is credited with creating the first automobile. He patented in 1885 to 1886. It was the first from the ground up designed gasoline powered car. Henry Ford is kind of miscommonly associated with the first automobile invention, but he had pioneered the assembly line and not the actual automobile in 1913. But this revolutionized the cost of producing those cars and then making them in mass, and then gave them out to people. So kind of a continuation of automobiles, and what are they? So modern automobiles contain 30,000 different parts and components. Initially, the first automobiles contained only around 1,000 parts. Then we get towards the middle of the 20th century, containing about 10,000, 15,000 parts, and then today at 30,000 parts. This is significant because the more that these cars become more complex, they need more parts, and these parts come from all over the world. And for my project data, I used a lot of the International Trade Administration information, looking at completed automobiles, specifically passenger vehicles and light trucks. So as I kind of mentioned before, not looking at things like buses or dump trucks or bicycles, but actually finished assembled automobiles. So another research question I'd asked, and looking a little bit more deeper into the role of cars in our society, they enable the freedom of movement. They serve as a key pillar in allowing us to go where we want to go, when we want to go, largely unrestricted. They also serve as a key economic pillar in the American economy, supporting the commute for millions of workers. I believe in 2022, around 70% of people commuted to work by car, and the automotive manufacturing, assembly, support, maintenance, and sales industries also serve as a key economic driver. Kind of conversely, in a more negative sense, cars do contribute to climate change and environmental degradation, with the average car emitting about 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. And while it's not inherently bad or a negative consequence, oftentimes the development of our land and road and highway construction is kind of car-oriented, so that the way that we design our cities, roads, and other places are designed around how people can get there from point A to point B by car, as opposed to walking or rail or buses and so forth. And then just kind of show the scale of automobiles in our country. In 2022, there were 283,400,986 vehicles registered, with around 91.7% of households having at least one automobile within their household. So as a GIS minor, I do see cars quite a bit, specifically looking at things like traffic and transportation flow analyses, urban and community planning, various environmental studies, emergency management, public safety, and then also looking at marketing and business trends. So, cars as international products. Cars themselves are very international products. As I mentioned before, they are comprised of tens of thousands of different components coming from all over the globe. Cars as international products was kind of driven by the rise of globalization, specifically the outsourcing of labor, whether that be cheaper labor or more skilled labor, the access and trade of rare earth minerals. This being done to just increase the overall efficiency of these companies and competitiveness. So because of this globalization, there's been a rise in international supply chain reliances. Looking at these thousands of independent companies and corporations supplying the automobile industry. However, there have been shifts towards more regional and the diversification, of suppliers following shocks to global supply chains. Some of examples of these would include things like the COVID-19 pandemic and conflicts threatening different trade routes. So kind of looking at here's a pie chart looking at kind of U.S. new car sales by parent company. Obviously, we have our big ones looking at things like Toyota, Ford, General Motors, and Hyundai. Down here in the bottom, we can see the rest of the bunch. Ford and General Motors are American companies, obviously, and Toyota and Hyundai are examples of international companies kind of having a dominant stance in the U.S. market, and Toyota being Japanese and Hyundai Korean. Towards the bottom left there, we can see the U.S. sale by companies by country ownership. Japan having the most at 5 companies, U.S. at 2, Germany at 2, the Republic of Korea at 1, and the Netherlands at 1. I should also mention that this extends to the parent company, so not necessarily the brands itself. So parent company might be Toyota, for example, or General Motors, but then below that have things like Chrysler and so forth and their brands within the parent company. So continuing on with talking about cars and international products, this is a very kind of simplified or primitive look at the automotive supplier pyramid. Kind of going from the top down. On the top, we have our OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers. So this can be thought of as a product made by a company for its own company. For example, Ford making a Ford headrest to go into a Ford car. And then below them, we have our tier 1 suppliers. They're heavily involved in the OEM design and engineering processes, given how specific they are to the specific cars themselves. These include things like engine systems, transmissions, and airbags. And then furthermore, below them, we have our tier 2 suppliers. Their primary activity is to support tier 1 supplier activity. They comprise things like subcomponents, seats, and computer chips. And on the very bottom, we have our tier 3 suppliers. They have a very limited connection with the OEMs and tier 1 suppliers, and are primarily responsible for the things like the extraction of raw materials and things like rubbers, metals, and plastics. So this kind of leads me to my next research question, and then the first map of this GIS presentation. Where is the United States imports its cars from? I'll dive into this map a little bit further, but the primary ones are countries like Japan, Mexico, South Korea, Canada, and Germany. So this is the graph breaking down the U.S. automobile and light truck import average between 2019 to 2024. In the bottom right here, we have a map showing where those countries are, and then stylized by the kind of the yellow to the dark red of how many are imported in terms of value, U.S. dollars specifically. Like I said before, the key ones being Mexico, Japan, Korea, Canada, and Germany, with the significance there being obviously Canada and Mexico being so close to us in North America, and then just historic manufacturing in places like Asia and Western/Central Europe. So looking at our first automotive trade partner between the U.S. and Japan, as we can see, a very significant deficit exists, with the dark green stylized the amount of imports the U.S. imports in terms of automotives compared to how much we export back to Japan. As I said, the specific deficit does exist, and the automotive industry in Japan itself comprises 13.9% of the country's manufacturing GDP. And Japan itself benefits from proximity to other Asian manufacturers and suppliers to get those parts to then make and assemble these final cars before exporting them to the United States. Something I found kind of significant or interesting was the fact that 2/3 of Japanese automotive vehicle manufacturing actually takes place overseas. This is done to avoid tariffs and other trade restrictions and also meet local market demands. So for an example, this would be like a Toyota manufacturer being here in the US, making Toyota cars to then be sold to the US market and not be exported back to Japan. The next significant automotive trade profiles between the US and Mexico. A very similar trade deficit exists between both of these countries, with the US importing a lot more than it exports back to Mexico. And in Mexico itself, the automotive industry comprises 18% of the country's manufacturing GDP. And something else that I found quite interesting about the country's automotive assembly industry is the fact that 88% of its vehicles produced are actually exported. They don't stay in Mexico. And 76% of them are then exported back to the United States. This can partially be explained by lower labor costs and the proximity to United States and Canadian suppliers, benefiting from things like the United States, Mexico, Canada free trade agreement. And while this free trade does exist, there are certain restrictions. For example, like an engine made in Mexico would actually need to be made with a certain percent of like parts from the North American continent. I think 75%, I believe. Then just kind of rounding out the last three, the top five: Korea, Japan, and Canada. So for Korea, there is 13% of the country's manufacturing GDP comes from the automotive industry. And I kind of stylized this intentionally. As you can see, that pie chart's kind of opening up as the trade deficit gets lower and lower, and there's more of a balance in trade. So Korea has a very similar profile and benefits as to Japan in terms of being close to other suppliers and Asian manufacturers. However, unlike Japan, there's a very high concentration of domestic production and part and finally assembly. So unlike Japan, which has a lot of manufacturing outside of the country, these cars are kind of from the ground up built in Korea to then be exported to places like the United States. So next up, the U.S. and German automotive trade profile. In Germany, the automotive industry comprises 19% of the country's manufacturing GDP. However, Germany actually has a lot of US-based production to meet its demands in Europe and Asia, meaning that a lot of these German countries do have production in the US. They build a car here in the United States, export it back to Germany to then be sold in Europe and Asia as well. However, the industry has seen a slight decline in recent years. They haven't really recovered from COVID, especially, and this is primarily driven by energy issues empowering its industry, as well as increased global competition from other competitors. And then finally, the last significant profile I found to be was the US-Canada trade profile. So this is probably the most balanced trade profile in terms of automotive imports and exports. And the automotive manufacturing industry comprises 10% of the country's GDP. And there's more of a balance between the automotive trade. This can primarily be explained by historic trade patterns between the US and Canada, and integration of supply chains, making it easier to get parts and components and the finished automobiles between Canada and the US. And like Mexico, it also benefits from the USMCA free trade agreements. So kind of pivoting towards my next research question of how are automobiles imported and transported. On the top left there and then bottom right, those are two examples of ro-ro vessels, which I'll talk about here in a moment on the next slide. And then I think we're all pretty familiar with what trains and cars are themselves, but on the top right there is a train, an auto rack, and locomotives. And then on the bottom left there, a truck hauling cars. So what are ro-ro vessels? And a little bit of a discussion on ocean logistics. So ro-ro stands for roll on and roll off. These vessels have built-in ramps and handling equipments to transport cars. And essentially, these can be kind of summed up as the boats come to the ports, they drop down a ramp, and then cars or any vehicle for that matter can be driven up onto them and then shipped internationally by water over the ocean. So these vessels usually have 7 to 8 interconnected decks and can have the larger ro-ros have a capacity for around 5,000 vehicles or cars, excuse me. But depending on things like tractors, military equipment, tanks, buses, those take up a larger space, and therefore there's a little bit less of them being transported. So looking at the industry of ro-ro vessels, there's around 782 within the global fleet itself, and about 70 companies operate about 80% of these vessels. So there's a very small number of companies actually operating the number of these vessels. As I kind of mentioned, the unloading and loading operations are enabled by on-ship equipment. The volume at which these vehicles can be loaded and then unloaded are heavily dependent on the port's storage capacity, meaning that if a ro-ro vessel does dock at a port, these cars need to be stored somewhere before they can then be transported and taken elsewhere. For example, you wouldn't really expect a ro-ro vessel to pull up at a port like, in Ashland, Wisconsin. There's no space there to actually hold the cars, unload the cars, drop the ramps, and stuff like that. Also, kind of a unique challenge that these vessels do kind of create or are a part of is there's very confined spaces, and which cars themselves are very flammable. They have fuel on board. A lot of their components are very fire prone. And because it's such a confined space, as you can see here, there's not a lot of room between the cars as they're stored there. If a fire starts on one car, it spreads very quickly to the other vehicles on board and creates a very unique challenge for first responders and crews of the vessels. So just kind of looking at an example of one of these voyages of a ro-ro vessel. This is actually a real vessel, a real voyage that's taking place right now actively. As I've kind of stylized there towards the middle, it's actually had left Nagoya in Japan yesterday, so it's currently somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. But this this slide and this information summarizes how international the whole process is. It's not so much just going from one point, like point A to point B. It's a very interconnected international process going between different ports, different countries, different places. Specifically, this one over a month, comprising 11 stops and 17,000 miles, with the initial ones being in Japan, Korea, back to Japan again, before crossing the Pacific to Tacoma, which is in Washington, then down to Long Beach in California, then Panama, then traverse the Panama Canal and head towards Brunswick, which is in Georgia, and then Baltimore, which is in Maryland, before finally crossing the Atlantic and then going to Germany as final destination. So looking at another map I created, this is kind of the end of journey, so where these cars are ending up at, specifically stylizing the demand for U.S. new cars in the U.S. On the bottom there, I've shown the top cars for new cars being sold of California, Texas, New York, and Florida. This can primarily be explained by the country's high GDP. So that's in the millions of millions, so trillions, with California being the highest at roughly 3.4 trillion US dollars, and then Texas, New York, and Florida, which has been stylized in the map there as well. And part of this is also explained not just simply by the GDP or population, but a lot of these places have very urban areas. It's very critical to get from city to city by car. There is public infrastructure that does exist outside of these cars, but there are also a lot of growing urban areas and the cities increasing in population size. As I kind of mentioned before, looking at that pie chart of the actual U.S. parent companies, or excuse me, international parent companies, this is a breakdown of the actual kind of the brands. So on the top there, we have our, Ram, Jeep, GMC, and so forth, getting down to the bottom, the more popular ones of Ford and Toyota. This is a map I created, kind of showing the imported cars' points of entry. On the top there, we have our US and Canada border looking at the different points of entry. I specifically stylized the points for trucks and trains. There are numerous crossing points for both people, like pedestrian bridges, crossings for just cars, but these are specifically spots that trains carrying automobiles or semi-trucks carrying automobiles can enter, with the same being said for the US-Mexico border as well. For the East Coast and the West Coast, I've also stylized where the ports are located themselves. There's roughly 75 US deep sea ports, and around 39 of these have auto importing capabilities, meaning that these ro-ro vessels can come in, dock, load, or unload their automobiles. Looking a little bit more at the Canadian border, there's around 173 of these crossing points, specific for truck and rail, with truck having the most at 155 compared to only 23 for the rail. And the US-Mexico border, there's only 24 crossing points that for these truck and rail. And I think that this can be kind of explained by, as I mentioned before, the overall integration of supply chains. The US and Canada are much more integrated compared to Mexico. And then specific figures on the actual automotive trade is not available at these locations, so it's kind of hard to summarize specifically where cars are being imported from the US from Canada to the US, and then also from Mexico back to the US. But in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about how that's kind of, correlated or summarized. So looking here at truck and rail transportation, I've kind of shown the volume of some of these crossing points on the US and Mexico border. I wanted to stylize and show what the volume was at specific ports on the East and West Coast, but there was kind of a discrepancy of either different data from two different sources or just no data to begin with, so it's kind of hard to map that and show that. But as we can see here, there's a pretty high concentration around the border with Canada around Detroit, which obviously Detroit's a pretty historic or famous, at least for the automotive industry. And then also down towards Mexico, I believe that's around El Paso, Texas there. And I think that this is also kind of showing that since there is so few crossing points between the United States and Mexico, those two near San Diego and then El Paso have such a high volume of crossings of both the truck and the rail, as opposed to Canada, which is a little bit more spread out over all of the crossing points. So for rail transportation, it's very much used for kind of international and transcontinental transportation. So going from Canada to the United States, across the United States, and then Mexico into the United States, and vice versa. Trains obviously require railroad infrastructure, so they're limited to their tracks. Trains can't go outside their tracks. They have to kind of go where the tracks can take them. And these trains, the specific railroad cars for carrying automobiles are known as auto racks. They have a capacity of around 10 to 26 cars per auto rack. And then obviously there are needed facilities and support equipment are needed for loading and unloading cars from trains themselves. And often at these points, they're unloaded from trains and loaded onto the trucks for their final delivery and their final destination. And kind of beneath that, then talking about trucks a little bit, they're kind of used for regional transportation. They're very highly mobile. Obviously, unlike trains, they're not limited by the rails. They can go where the roads go. But they do have certain height and weight restrictions, whether it be for bridges or both in terms of height and weight. and specifically the trucks themselves have 5 to 10 car capacity. So it just makes a little more sense for the trains to carry the cars over long distances because it's a little bit cheaper due to how many cars you can transport all at once based on like a gallon of fuel. And these trucks are a little bit easier for transporting cars to, let's just say, like dealerships or your home if you just specifically bought a car. So my next map, looking at the United States assembly of cars. So the United States itself always has had a deficit of importing more cars than it produces, just simply to meet the country's demand for new automobiles. This industry had a value of 2.3 or $23.5 billion, which is the pretty high number. And across the entire country, there's 51 automobile assembly plants, and 10 million, around 10 million automobiles were produced or assembled, excuse me, in 2024. This industry itself employs 300,038 people, with Ford and General Motors, those two American companies, kind of having the most employed people at 49% of the total market. And there's roughly 7 million jobs in supporting activities as well. So in this map itself, I didn't specifically stylize it, but there is a kind of that historic production in Michigan and the upper Midwest for U.S. production. But a lot of that development and production, these plants in the southeast, are a lot of the international production. So like companies like BMW, Toyota, Hyundai. This can primarily be explained by the fact that they have received certain incentives, whether it be a foreign direct investment or tax breaks, or the fact that a lot of these states do have cheaper labor, so it's a little bit easier for these companies to move in and set up their new assembly plants. There's a few reasons why they kind of there's that U.S.-based international production. It's primarily to avoid tariffs and other trade restrictions, but also they can kind of locate their production near their consumer bases, so they can build a car here in the U.S. and then get it out a little bit easier to who's buying it. And this also allows them to maintain their global competitiveness overall. So kind of to conclude and wrap up my presentation, I've got some thoughts on the future and just an industry outlook. So the industry itself is projected to grow through 2030 with emerging markets in Europe and Latin America and the adoption of EVs and hybrid automobiles globally. However, there are certain concerns facing the industry, especially the US specifically, from competition and the United States kind of aging production facility and inability to kind of produce different cars. Obviously, in the US, the past few years, there's been more and more SUVs and trucks being built just simply due to consumer demand. So it's not as easy to kind of shift gears and build other cars compared to those SUVs and trucks, unlike the other companies. So certain sustainability and electric vehicle initiatives. There's been shifts in sourcing of earth minerals as more companies become environmentally conscious of where they get their materials from and how they do that. Environmental sensitivity. Also, that's just kind of a part of that corporate social responsibility and companies being more aware of what their impact is on the environment in terms of where they get their cars from, the components to make those cars, and the raw materials to make those components. So autonomous cars is also a very big or interesting topic in the world of the automotive industry, looking at where it's going to be researched and development and then produced, as well as certain geopolitical issues, such as the tariff situation. I'm sure we've all heard of tariffs in the news recently, and how that's going to affect the industry. And then also certain conflicts of trade routes. For example, in the Middle East with the rebel attacks, and then vessels having to change on which route they are going then. So just kind of reflecting on my experience with the research project and recommendations for areas of future research, I think it'd be quite interesting to look at the where the United States is sending its automobiles, so not just look at the imports, but the exports themselves. Then also just the international trade of parts and components. As I mentioned before, cars are comprised of 30,000 different parts and components. So it's a pretty significant high number. So looking at where these come from and then how they get here as well, compared to the actual finished automobile itself. And then also the reverse logistics and supply chains. So something I found kind of interesting looking at this research project is the U.S. actually exports a lot of used cars to places like Africa and so forth. So I think that also be kind of an interesting process to look at. And then just simply broader supply chains. So thank you for being such a great audience, being attentive and listening to my presentation. I'd like to thank Dr. Lee for helping with my research project this semester, and I'll open up to questions now.